2017. Tonight we get to review another book from Harriet Lerner, one of my favorite self-help authors. And one of the reasons why I like Dr. Lerner is because she gets it so consistently. So you know you're not just getting somebody who has a technique or a small piece of the puzzle, but somebody who's obviously not just a great thinker, but who has done a lot of their own work. And her work comes out of a private practice. And so I have a lot of respect for that also, because I think a lot of people can do research, or can do education and academics, but really the wealth for me comes in doing my own personal work, and the therapists that I've met that have been really gifted at what they do, the same is almost always true for them. So with that preamble, let me get right into it. So her book is called The Dance of Fear, and we're going to talk about a few different things tonight. We're going to talk about fear, we're going to talk about shame, we're going to talk about courage. I'll mention some things around embarrassment and anxiety, and she makes some distinction between all of them. I'm also going to talk a little bit about guilt tonight. But she starts off, and I think she does a great job of this in all of her work, where she reminds you of the human experience, and that to be human means that you're going to fall somewhere on the continuum of mental health and wellness at any given moment. That all of us have anxiety, and that being human means that we're going to experience the ecstasy, the wonderment of being human, and we're also going to experience the misery of being human. So the joy and the misery are something that we have together. And there's a theme throughout her book of this idea of embracing all, a kind of mindfulness. At times she makes a mindful recognition or awareness that not everybody can be mindful all the time, but that there is a practice in dealing with our shame, our fear, and anxiety, of mindfulness, of embracing it, of learning from it, leaning into it, and also at the same time finding out what richness, what lessons, what wisdom it also has to offer you. There's no simple way out of fear. You know, I think I've shared this idea before, where I used to think for many years that therapy was going to result, I think, substantially in removing my fear in situations, and that then I would be able to go out in the world and be myself, and be authentic, and say courageous things about who I was and how I felt. And I remember exactly where I was when it came to me after having another wonderful session with my therapist, where throughout the session, during the session, I was incredibly at peace with myself, with what I needed to say and do in my relationships. And then I remember the moment where I was on the off-ramp of the freeway getting home, where I realized the fear had almost completely returned. And it was at that moment that I realized that I was going to have to learn to tolerate fear and do it anyway. The therapy was never going to completely take away my fear, but I could, those moments, those anchoring moments, those centering and grounding moments. And that can happen in a therapy session, of course. I think that's probably the most ideal setting, because that's a setting where you're in relationship with somebody. But that can happen when you're reading a book, or listening to a webinar or a podcast, right? When somebody's sharing with you something that they've learned, or you're attending a 12-step meeting, where you have this sense of okayness, right? That can be the anchoring moment. But then remembering that when you go back out in the world, that those waves of fear are then going to hit you. And you can recall from those experiences thoughts, ideas, concepts, even draw from the feeling that you felt, that it'll be okay. That at times we have to practice almost as it is a mantra, to talk ourselves and remind ourselves of what we know, even though the emotional experience can be very terrifying. So there's no simple way out of fear. Obviously, fear and anxiety can be warnings, right? They can help us avoid unnecessary and dangerous decisions in our lives, situations in our lives. So again, that's the difficulty with it. If fear was always, if anxiety was always negative, then we could simply work to eradicate it, if it were possible. But we can't. And at times, some of the difficulty that I think a lot of us get into is we do feel a certain feeling, like an anxiety about something. And because we have such self-doubt, right? We're not in the practice of being in touch and embracing our feelings, we can talk ourselves out of it. And that's where I'm going to go to, I think, what one of the big points in this work is. The idea that the best way to foster confidence and clarity is to allow children to feel. And the reason that we don't know what to do can, in many ways, be traced back to where we taught how to feel. And by being taught how to feel, what I mean by that is, were we allowed to feel? Was it embraced? Was it honored? I know a lot of parents don't want to look at it that way. They don't want to look back on their own childhood because they don't have any kind of overt anger with their parents or leftover emotions. But it is, if not the most significant way, it is a contributing factor for us. Our ability to feel and know what we feel is something that can later on give us clarity. And I know that almost sounds too simple when I say it that way. We know what we want. Conversely, a lot of times we get told what is right, what is wrong, how we should be feeling, right? And sometimes the more subtle that message is given, the more hard it is to pull it apart and unpack it. But learning to feel it, learning to lean into it, learning to embrace it, paying attention to it. And like I said, in many ways, therapy can be, if not the only way, definitely a critical part of doing this, because that's where we get to be in dialogue, in relationship. If we don't learn to express our fear, learn to feel, we can end up acting it out, right? In anxieties and in neurotic behaviors, and other symptoms of self-medicating or self-soothing that can be inappropriate or destructive in our lives. I love this idea that she teaches in the book. Feelings aren't a package, are a package deal, they're a package deal. We can't simply go back and select the ones that we want to feel, right? Where there is joy, there is also sorrow and pain, right? Where there is love, there is also loss and grief. And so this is part of a full picture, that if we were to carve out any of these emotions, that we would be incomplete, less whole. And then she talks about this idea, I love this idea, it might be unpleasant to feel these feelings, but it is evidence that we are alive, right? I told the story about a friend who was going through a really traumatic situation with this child, where his young child had a terminal illness, and it was a painful and difficult illness. Many surgeries. At birth, she was predicted to live to the age of about 12 years old, if they were lucky, and I think that's about the exact age that she lived to. And during the waning months of her life, he would post for friends updates on social media about how she was doing and things they were trying. And I bumped into his brother at a conference, at a professional conference, or actually it was a friend. I bumped into a mutual friend at a professional conference years ago, and I said, have you seen so-and-so's postings and how difficult it is? And he said, yeah. And I said, I can't bother to look at it. Sometimes I take a screenshot of it, and I want to learn about what he's going through, but it takes me maybe a day to read all of it. I'll read little bits and pieces at a time. And my mutual friend said very gently to me, and he said, but doesn't the pain that you feel remind you that you're alive, help you know that you're alive? And immediately, for me, that was another aha moment, where I had this difference in a relationship with my feelings. So she talks about this idea that our painful, difficult emotions are a signal that we're alive, and we're not going to be alive forever. And so it's something that we can also cherish. This kind of reframe can also help us to cherish it. She talks about her experience after 9/11. She began to gather articles about people's fears and reactions to 9/11, and most all of us on this can remember exactly where we were and what feelings came up for us. And then she also noticed, she gathered articles at the same time around what people were doing to cope with it and deal with it. And she kind of gathered all of that information. She came up with 8 things to help us understand what people were, how people were being helped. She said, talk. right? When a therapist is asking you questions like, how do you feel? He or she, it's not so much that he or she needs to know it, is that talking about it is a vehicle to feeling it. I've always said, if I could say to my clients, feel something, just feel what that feels like. And it would teach them, it would help them to move through it, or to help the feeling move through them. They might not even need to talk about it, but talking about it is a skill. It also connects us to the other people. I think one of the most important things I've learned with my own process, with my own grief and loss, is that the thing that I have felt most comforted by is when people have told me that I'm not alone, that they're with me. And in many cases, if they've had similar experiences that I either know about or they share with me. So talking can also connect us. So talk about what's going on. It's consistently, this is almost, again, too simple to say, it's consistently a part of all trauma recovery, that there's a lot of talking going on. Go for the facts. Anxiety escalates and fantasies flourish in the absence of information. And so after 9/11, she talked about this idea that everybody, we're hearing all these horrific stories about what could happen, right? And it was in our collective psyche, it was a real possibility. But learning about what's real, learning about what the facts are, can be helpful in us diminishing our irrational or exaggerated feels. Be reasonably vigilant. Right? That's even now today what we have to do in our airports when we fly. There's a reasonable vigilance. Having a hard time talking this evening. Vigilance that we can maintain. Don't be ashamed that there are certain risks that you choose to avoid. Right? It's okay. Visiting a certain country, for example, taking certain risks in certain neighborhoods at night would be unsafe for all of us. Steer clear of activities that just rev you up. For example, turn off the TV. I've thought about this for years because I've not been much of a news person or politics person. This recent election cycle has definitely had a pull on me. But what I've observed for years is that some people that I know in my family, it's almost like they're choosing to be miserable and angry and frustrated by watching the news and the TV. And there's this, I know it's almost a joke, a meme these days, that there's this tightrope that we walk between being informed and being miserable with what's going on in the world. So be aware of what you can handle. There are times, although I'm much more interested in the news than I used to be, there are times when I have to turn it off because I allow it to occupy space in my brain and to take away my serenity. Seek out activities that calm you down. For example, after you switch off the TV, take a walk, do some yoga, some stretches. Right? There are things, and she mentions this several times in here, that while there are no, and she avoids, see Dr. Lerner is really good because she avoids these kind of quick fixes, these 10-step processes, and then you will automatically be fixed. It's one of the things she makes the point that this book is not. This book, like her other books, is an invitation into a new kind of process, a new way of thinking about it. And she does list, however, some practices that can help to mitigate paralyzing or difficult fear or anxiety. Keep your perspective. Terrible things happen, and it's still possible to move forward with love and hope. And then connection, which I think relates back to the first thing. Connection, there's so much, and I'll talk about this at one other point tonight. There's so much about our pain, our shame, our guilt, our fears that connect us. You can't see the list, and I can, but there's a list of dozens of parents on here tonight. And some of you might even be in the same neighborhood, right? You might be in the same city, you might be in the same area. And there are hundreds and thousands of people just like you who have struggled with some of the same family issues that you've struggled with. And yet we spend so much time trying to present an image because we're afraid, right? That's part of shame, afraid of being rejected because of our imperfect, messy lives, when at the same time, if we're able to open up about that more and share, it would provide for more connection. Many common fears, she says, the fear of rejection, intimacy in social situations, or speaking in public, are about shame. At the bedrock of fear is the fear of being seen as essentially flawed, inadequate, and unworthy of being loved. I think that's a very simple definition of shame. At bedrock is the fear of being seen as essentially flawed, inadequate, or unworthy of being loved. And I want to be very clear about this because I talk with lots of clients about their shame. It can show up as depression and deflation. It can show up as inflation. It can show up as disconnection. It can show up as over-functioning and hyper-successful, right? The antithesis of course, is just authenticity, no pretense, just who we are. And that's a difficult thing for all of us. She goes on to say, shame is so painful that nobody talks about it personally or wants to go there. When was the last time you discussed your shame at the dinner table? Shame is the least talked about emotion because people are ashamed of their shame. Whether it's shame about your body, your teenager, or how you chew your food. Shame steers people into a life of silence, inactivity, lying and hiding. Or to avoid feeling shame, we may flip shame into contempt, arrogance, or displays of one-upsmanship. We can learn to do better than that, to face shame and to not let it stop it from being our best selves. I'll give you a couple of illustrations to talk about how shame in the treatment world is still so underexplored. There was a point when I give an in-service, sometimes I'll ask this question. I have to space it out so that it's not too common, but I'll ask the question of our staff, right, our frontline staff, when I'm talking about shame or coercion or providing a safe, healthy, emotional container. I'll say, how many people in this room, raise your hand if you've ever used your power, right, in the field, over students and clients, if you've ever used it irresponsibly or to feel better about yourself. Raise your hand. And I raise my hand and people raise their hand slowly. And I say, that's a trick question because if you've been doing this for any length of time, you do that, right? It's not something you aspire to or are proud of or is your common practice, but you're going to do it. When mentoring one of our staff who works at our intensives, I was talking about this work that we do around, as a therapist, looking at your own stuff. When a client gets upset with you, frustrated, when a client feels like you're not hearing them, how to stay tuned into the client instead of defending yourself and using all of your skills and tools and vocabulary to do it. And I was saying this is really the gold of therapy, right? This is the real stuff. And they won't, I said to her, and they won't teach a lot about it in graduate school. And my staff members said to me, they said, why not? This seems like the most important thing that they could talk about. And I answered simply because most professors haven't done their work. Most professors don't look at their own shame. And so it's pervasive. It's part of the human existence. It's part of being human. And in fact, Dr. Lerner, I don't have a slide that I talk about this, but she gives a great example where her mother-in-law, I believe it was, in order to have that discussion about shame at the dinner table, said as dinner was ending one night, what if you were to walk out of the room, what would be the one thing you'd be most afraid people would say about you? It was a great way to begin to talk about shame in a family. Gave another example where a father, struggling with his son's weight issues, was able to trace it back to some of his own shame about losing his father, and he led with that. Right? He told his son about that, about the shame that he felt growing up. That led to a positive connection and set a groundwork for being able to talk about health and body and weight in a healthy, non-shaming way. Learning to face our feelings. We can't avoid these feelings either. I'm convinced that the more we look at these uninvited guests in the eye with patience and curiosity, the more we learn to spot their wisdom as well as their mischief, the less the grip they have on us. You know, I talk about this with students all the time. There is this idea that the unexpressed fear or anxiety or shame is less powerful. It becomes more powerful, more insidious in our lives. Excuse me. It becomes in some ways, we give it more power. And there's a huge theme throughout her entire book in dealing with shame and fear and anxiety. And she talks about many different ways of doing it and approaching it and how it's so different for everybody. But it is facing it. It is walking into it. She gives an example of a client named Frank who comes to her, wants to do a one-session kind of thing. He's coming back into town. He'd moved away from her town in Kansas and wanted to have a session with her. And she was reluctant to meet with him because she doesn't tend to think of therapy as kind of a one-session fix-all. She tends to think like I do, that it's a longer period of time and that there's several different ways to explore, but that it takes a long time. But she had worked with Frank before in an earlier phase of his therapy, and she thought that she had heard something that might address this problem. Frank was horribly afraid of asking a woman named Liz at work out. And he was petrified, overly anxious. One thing that Dr. Lerner mentions is, with something like this, is she wanted to assess his motivation, because if his motivation was low, then the anxiety would win out every time. But if the motivation was high, then he could use that motivation to go through something that was going to be really uncomfortable. I thought this was a incredibly ingenious intervention she had actually borrowed from Chloe Madonis, a very profound and significant contributor to marriage and family therapy. The idea was that she thought that Frank just needed more experience with rejection, that he had built it up into something too overwhelming. And so what she said is she wanted to accumulate experience of rejection. So she said, I want you to go ask out. And she gave him a very short 2-sentence script. I want you to go ask out in a shopping mall 75 women, and I want you to get 75 no's. And she knew Frank to be a non-intimidating person. She also knew him to be sensitive and aware of social cues, and so she said, I wouldn't give this intervention to everybody, but basically Frank went about doing it, and he started asking people, and the line went something like this. He said, excuse me, I don't want to be rude, but I was wondering if you'd be willing to come and sit and have a cup of coffee with me. And so he started this practice, and after a few of them, I think it was like 4 into it, a woman said yes. And he quickly realized it was going to take a lot longer for him to accumulate a lot of no's. And so this would happen. He would ask a few people, and then a woman would say yes. So then he'd have a cup of coffee with them. And at one point he said he saw this, to him, this incredibly intimidating woman. So well put together. I guess you could say probably the best way to describe it is way out of his league is what he thought. And so he thought, she'll definitely say no to me. But he was also horribly intimidated. So in the middle of contemplating whether he'd talk to her, he decided to call Liz, the woman that he'd been hoping to ask out. He left a message on her answer machine, as simple as could be. He found out later that she was already involved with somebody else, but he'd overcome his fear, and he'd started to meet other people and be more willing. And so this reframe of being more comfortable with rejection, again, it speaks to that idea of learning to face it, learning to face our fears and anxieties. There's almost no substitute. It reminds me of the allegory in The Knight in Rusty Armor. When you approach the dragon of fear and doubt, it gets smaller. When you run away from it, it gets bigger and more real. So the conclusion is that action is powerful and hard to substitute. That is why, as in my earlier example, when I was getting off the freeway after a therapy session, that I had to do something different for it to change. And that success is built upon a foundation of failing. Right? That we have to become more comfortable with our failing. I think a lot of parents, one of the things I say to parents, I think it's one of the handful of things that I think is so common with the parents that I deal with, is that they get more comfortable with their children failing. Right? That things not be measured so simply in terms of pass or fail. That we have to learn to risk feeling ridiculous, which most of us are terrified of. We have to invite fear in, right? Invite it to feel it, to examine it, to explore where it might be coming from, what it might mean to us, where those messages might be coming from. And then, of course, motivation matters. With regard to rejection, Dr. Lerner says, when we take rejection as proof of our inadequacies, I think this is a great quote. When we take rejection as proof of our inadequacies, it is hard to allow ourselves to risk being truly seen again. How can we open ourselves to another person if we fear that he or she will discover what we're trying to desperately hide, that we are stupid, boring, incompetent, needy, or in some way deeply inadequate? Rejection is the fast route back to childhood shame. So I think this is one of the things that we don't talk a lot about in parenting, but I think for a lot of us, because our own childhood shame, our fear of being rejected, we can easily have a regressive experience even with our own children, right? And we have to recognize, I've told the story before about a mother, and this has happened more than one time, coaching a parent to do or to say something in a letter or in a session, because I'm getting from them that this is their truth, and so giving them some language to help them say what they need to say. Having their child subsequently be upset about it in some way. And then a parent immediately going back to this place, I did something wrong. I feel so badly. That's not true. Somebody being upset, or in this case, as Dr. Lerner says, rejecting you is not evidence of your inadequacies. In the book, The Four Agreements, he talks about the idea of it's not about you. Don't take it personally is the name of that agreement. If somebody thinks you're the greatest in the world, it's not about you. If somebody thinks you're a horrible person, it's not about you. But we do this because of our own childhood shame, because of our own sense of feeling defeated when we were younger. That's why people can defeat us now. Healthy and not healthy. Fear can be a positive force if it occurs at the right time and in the correct dose. If it helps us to connect more deeply to our shared humanity. If we read it correctly in order to cope with the current challenge or future threat. If it serves as a positive motivating force or simply adds zest to our lives. So, that's a lot to say about fear and anxiety. And to be able to see that fine print, those fine brushstrokes, we're going to have to lean into it instead of what is common for most of us and in our culture to avoid it. She talks about how anxiety lies to us. Usually, she says, anxiety is a mean trickster. It signals you to pay attention, but it also turns your brain to oatmeal, narrows and rigidifies your focus, and obscures the real issue from view. Anxiety tricks you out of the now as you obsessively replay and regret the past and worry about the future. It tricks you into losing sight of your competence and your capacity for love, creativity, and joy. It tricks you into believing that you are lesser and smaller than you really are. Anxiety interferes with self-regard and self-respect, the foundation on which all else rests. So anxiety is when we think of it as a chronic, consistent presence condition in our life, a state-like trait, it can become debilitating in these ways. And it will not tell us the truth about outcomes or about what will happen. And if we've experienced trauma in our life, and all of you, I would venture to say, have experienced trauma if you've had a child in our program, or a program like ours. You've experienced some trauma, if not before your child's issues or presentation, then after your child's presentation and issues. It is hard not to respond from a trauma based from an anxious place. I remember for years, I don't think this served my firstborn son very well at all. I remember for years that I would play out in my mind reading impact letter after impact letter, letter from parents after letter from parents, where they described, we saw early signs. This is what we saw when you were younger. And asking myself on a daily basis, am I going to be writing a letter like that someday to my child? Because of the signs I see when he's 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Right? I had vicarious trauma in that way, carried it. And then, like I said, there are many faces. While anxiety drives feelings of worthlessness and incompetence, in some people, it inspires narcissism and grandiosity in others. So anxiety, fear, and shame, which is a fear of rejection, of being unloved, can also lead us to overcompensate. We have examples in our lives that we can see where people who we know are dramatically insecure, but who never display it because they present with a narcissistic presentation. Talking about the overfunctioning and underfunctioning anxious person. So to overfunction. I spelled those words wrong twice on the slide, exactly the same. The overfunctioner, they feel that they know what's best, not just for themselves, but for others as well. They move in quickly to advise, rescue, mediate, and take over. Have difficulty sitting back and allowing others to struggle with their own problems. Avoid anxiety about their own personal goals and problems by focusing on others. Have difficulty sharing their own vulnerabilities, underfunctioning side, especially with those that are viewed as having problems. Being labeled as the person who is always reliable and always together. This is what an overfunctioner looks like. Some of that are themes that I hear from the parents that I work with all the time. Right? That's a common set of themes. So is that part of what's going on? In couples, overfunctioners and underfunctioners tend to pair up together. They match well. In addition, overfunctioning parents tend to raise or be matched up with underfunctioning children. Because if you become all of the resources for your child, then they don't need to rely. They take the complementary position, don't need to rely or develop their own resources. Similarly, I don't think it's the case with a lot of our parents, but underfunctioning parents oftentimes raise overfunctioning children because the child has to take care of everything. So the list from the underfunction: have several areas where you just can't get organized. Become less competent under stress, thus inviting others to take over. Tend to report physical or emotional symptoms when stress is high in your family or at your job. Become the focus of gossip, worry, or concern. Earn such labels as the fragile one, the thick one, the sick one, or the lazy or incompetent one. Have difficulty showing your strong, competent side to intimate others. How does anxiety affect us? It can be a warning sign, but chronic state anxiety has debilitating effects. It limits your ability to think and make decisions rationally. You use, as it talks about in the book, Parenting from the Inside Out, you lose your response flexibility. Dr. Lerner says that your thinking capacity reduces to the size of a pinto bean, right? Under anxiety, we're very rigid. We move into fight and flight responses. It perceives everything as a severe threat, right? Everything can be played out. I can catastrophize all the way to the end of the story when I see something. It can destroy our capacity to create ambiguity, including the way that you look at yourself. So we lose our capacity to see the gray. We see things as black and white. Another really rigid stance. I love the idea of counter moves that Dr. Lerner has, and she also talks about that in her book, The Dance of Anger, one of my favorites of all time. Counter moves are when we make a change in our lives, and she talks about the fear of change. When we make a change in our lives, that we prepare ourselves for the counter moves of others. And she says that they're set up in these three basic ways, steps. First of all, the message that you're wrong, with volumes of evidence to support it. Change back and we will accept you again are the messages you get from your family or loved ones. If you don't change back, these are the consequences which are then listed. And most importantly, what she says is preparing ourselves, reminding ourselves, role-playing, thinking about them. All of those things can be helpful. But we spend so much time trying to get counter moves not to happen, trying to talk the person out of it, trying to get it to not happen at all. She says your job is not to prevent the counter move from happening, which is impossible, nor is it to advise the other person not to react that way. Real courage requires you sit with the anxiety that change evokes and stay on course when the counter moves start rolling in. Think about that with your children. Think about their reactions. Think about their change back, their counter moves. And if this is true, and I believe this to be true from my own experience, that instead of trying to talk the other person out of it, giving your child a lecture, telling them they shouldn't be mad at you, debating with them, arguing, lecturing, nagging. Instead of doing all that, that we practice the courage to stick with it and walk through it and do something different. A good portion of her book is about shame. I talked to her the other day, actually, on the phone, and I found this fascinating. She said she actually didn't list shame in the title because people might not read it. People don't see that they have it. And it is it's the common cold of mental health, right? It's everywhere. She talks about the distinction between embarrassment, shame, and guilt. There's a way in which she talks about this that I don't quite agree with. This one part. She talks about guilt as similar to conscience, and I have a webinar on shame and guilt. It is my experience that people experience guilt as I've done something to hurt somebody else, which may or may not be right or wrong. So she talks about embarrassment as kind of light, embarrassed that you do something in front of somebody silly. Shame is a deeper sense of I am bad, I am unworthy, I'm inadequate. And guilt is this instinct that I've done something wrong. And she talks about healthy versus unhealthy guilt. But I will tell you that my experience is that there's a capacity to go beyond guilt, because guilt is unreliable. Most people, clients and parents alike, tell me that one of the biggest barriers to them doing the right thing in their life is guilt, because they have been conditioned to believe that when they do something else that somebody's upset about, displeased with, hurt by, that they've done something wrong. And I think the higher laws are love, compassion, empathy, awareness, sensitivity, courage, authenticity. I think those are the ingredients of morality, not guilt. That's one area where, when I talked to her the other day about this, she said, like, we use the same language, but I want to go ahead and erase the idea of guilt as something that can be a reliable source of morality, because so many people struggle with it. So many people misinterpret it. She talks about secondhand shame, and this is something very common to parents that we work with. This idea that I'm ashamed of my child's misbehavior, right? My child is acting out. He or she is at evoke. They're not in college like the other children. They're not having all these wonderful accomplishments. They're experiencing setbacks, mental health issues, addictions, and so forth. And then she talks about something I talk about very often, knowing and learning the difference between your piece and their piece. She gives an example where one mother, whose son in a small community had burnt down some prominent building in town, and then this woman started to avoid people, and the shame, like it does when we avoid it, got larger and larger and more debilitating. She had to practice this mantra: I am not my son, and my son is not me. And when I read that, I thought, out of context, that would be strange to repeat, but it makes so much sense. And I think it's really, really helpful to introduce to this group of people that you are not your daughter, you are not your son, and they are not you. And there's plenty of responsibility for parenting, to be an effective, loving parent, a curious parent, a patient parent, so forth and so on. There's plenty of things to focus on without taking on responsibility for what our child chooses to do with that. She talks about how facing it makes it smaller, and sticking together, right? Talking about it with others, sticking together, come to parent support groups. The reason we provide, our program has evolved over the past 20 years, 19 years. And what it's evolved to mirror is this idea of community, of getting people together. Our parent workshops, our parent support groups, our intensives, our new programming, right? It's more and more that we can get people together talking, the less isolated they feel. I've had a few clients tell me recently that they didn't want to call their therapist because they were afraid that they already knew, they didn't want to bother the therapist, and they already knew what he or she was going to say. And what I've reminded these people is, it's not just about what the therapist will say to you. It's about not being alone. Sometimes your therapist doesn't pull a rabbit out of a hat, doesn't have some quick magical reframe that makes you feel all better. But what they can do, if they're an adequate therapist, an adequate container, is hear you, be there with you, empathize with you. Sticking together, going to support groups is an important part of it. From Dr. Lerner, that what we believe is most shameful and unique about ourselves is often what is most human and universal. What a great quote. That what we believe is most shameful and unique about ourselves is often what is most human and universal. She talks about courage as we kind of turn the corner to how do we work through shame, fear, anxiety. She makes it very clear and I think a substantial point that a lot of us miss, that courage is not the absence of fear. If you're not afraid, she gives an example where she went, when she was in college, she went to India and some other countries, Nepal, and put herself at great risk and peril physically and wasn't afraid. And she said, I wasn't particularly courageous. I just didn't have fear. Courage is not having fear. It's doing something that we're afraid to do that we know we need to do. It can be different for everybody. Sometimes fear is speaking up. Sometimes fear is keeping quiet. She gives examples where somebody needs to stand up for themselves at the risk of being rejected, and somebody else, I think it was her, need to be quiet because it was more difficult to sit with herself and her silence than it was to jump into conflict, which she was really good at. Staying true to who you are in the face of fear is how she defines courage, and how I define courage. The avoidance is the seed that grows into paralyzing fear and shame. Over and over and over again. In our work. In this book. Making friends with your shame and your fear. Two examples for me. I've told, in fact, there's a blog on my personal website, drbradreedy.com, called The Out of Towner, Feeling Small and Showing Up Anyways, where I show up to this radio show with all of these people, and I felt so out of place, so inadequate, so small compared to everybody. It was in the studio in New York City. My publisher was the host, nationally broadcast radio show, and we were talking about gratitude. It was this time 2 years ago. And I absolutely bumbled the entire day, the entire 3 hours. I interrupted people. I told stories about myself. When my publisher, the radio host, asked me questions, I didn't answer because I had some preconceived thing that I was going to say that would make me look really important and really valuable and worthwhile. When I was leaving the studio, my wife looked at me and said, "What was that?" It was like a train wreck, and I knew it was true. She was right. And when I went back to my therapist to tell her about it, I cringed with shame, right? Shame is a shrinking, disappearing, wanting to disappear and hide kind of feeling. And I hated that part of me that showed up in that way. Talking about himself, trying to look important. And my therapist suggested what Dr. Lerner said, don't run away from it, don't hide, write about it, lean into it. It'll teach you something. And I did it, and I wrote this blog and published it a couple of years ago. But what it did for me is it allowed me to embrace it. And now I can see it coming more. Now when I have that same feeling or those same behaviors, instead of beating myself up for them, and how many of us do that, right? Instead of beating myself up for them, I embrace them. I recognize that you're feeling small. It reminds you of being a small child, the shame of your childhood, of not being listened to, not being of value. And you're okay. Right? I can have that whole dialogue in my head. And not that I've completely mastered it, but I'm much better at it since that experience, and since my therapist suggested that I lean into it and embrace it, than I am today. I forgot what the Iron Man example. I've written a note here. The Iron Man example. I ran an Iron Man, and I forgot what the example was. Well, that's too bad. Even though it was my example, I just wrote it down a few hours ago. Here are some take-home concepts. Everybody has an anxiety disorder, she says. If you're alive, you have an anxiety disorder. Just it's mild to severe. Anxiety increases comparisons. Another thing that I think most parents struggle with. You've experienced real trauma, like I said. If not before your child, then with your child. And that trauma then can trigger an anxiety issue. a trauma response. Learning to trust yourself is a key piece of this work. Doing it with somebody you trust. Just because you are anxious does not mean that your specific fear is unfounded. And again, sometimes when we hear about anxiety or think about it or are taught about it, we can go too far the other way, right? We can dismiss our feelings. The practice in therapy, folks, I'll say this as clear as I can. The practice in therapy is to develop a sensitivity, a sensibility where we learn to listen to it with different ears. Learn to appreciate your anxiety and all your feelings and the wisdom they have to offer you. Seek medical help or specific trauma help. If therapy doesn't work, that can be helpful. EMDR, biofeedback training, meditation, medication. If you can't even access therapy, then medication might be needed. Talk to a medical professional about that. Over-focusing on what others are doing wrong and getting reactive about it is a common automatic anxiety response. When I get anxious, I love this line. She says, when I get anxious, I get instructive. Just think if we had that as awareness as parents. And so many parents over so many years ask me the question about when is it time to teach? When is it time to lecture, to teach them something? And really, those moments are few and far between. It's the listening, it's the empathizing, sharing stories, your own fallibilities, your own struggles. All of those things become instructive and healing more than the lecturing. Your children memorize your lectures. And just like for most of us, they don't do a whole lot of good unless the psychological and emotional healing has occurred. Then those can take root. And then they take root fairly easily after that. When I get anxious, I get instructive. And then, of course, secondhand shame and learning the difference, where you separate from your child, where you are different and where you connect and where your identity is and what your responsibility is and what is theirs are really important. All right, I'm happy to take any live questions related to the topic before I go on to upcoming announcements. No questions yet. I'll go through some upcoming announcements and instructions. Please stay on and then I'll take any live questions. We want all families, we ask all families to just try it. This could be an example of doing something uncomfortable, something different. Go to 6 12-step support groups. Try different ones. They're not all the same. See what you can hear. See what core principles apply to all of us. Doesn't have to be a substance abuse or a substance addiction issue. Go to NAMI.org if you want more information in your area, free classes and education. You can listen to all these broadcasts on your iPhone, iOS device. You can pass these out to anybody. Go to the podcast app and search Evoke Therapy Programs and subscribe there. If you have an Android device, download the SoundCloud app and search Evoke Therapy Programs and subscribe there. On Twitter and Instagram, follow us at Evoke Therapy. Facebook, search Evoke Therapy Programs. Go to the Second Nature Alumni Foundation on Facebook to find out about, join, support an organization that helps people who can't afford therapy. Of course, our blog, my book, The Journey of the Heroic Parent, is available on Amazon, Regan Arts, REGAN, arts.com, and barnesandnoble.com. You can also go to the Parent Alumni Foundation page on Facebook, where if you buy books from Amazon through the Amazon Smiles program that have been recommended by our therapists, a percentage of the proceeds goes to help people who can't afford therapy. The next workshop, and we ask all families that can, we ask them to attend, November 18th and 19th at Entrada. You can combine that with a field visit if your therapist thinks it's appropriate timing. The next intensive, that's for deeper work. Talk about courage. If you want to do deeper work, look at your own history. The next one, and potentially last one that I may be doing, because I'm training some folks, hiring some folks, will be November 8th through 11th. I may be doing some beyond that, but this is the last one that I'm guaranteed to be doing. You can also do that with your family. We have Finding Family. You can set up an individual one. Email intensives@evoketherapy.com. Go to our website or call admissions. Also, we have parent support groups coming up. New York City, I'll be in New York this Sunday, 4:30 to 6:30 at the Courtyard New York Airport Marriott. In Chicago, next month on November 16th, the Renaissance Chicago, 6:30 to 8:30. I'll be back in Southern California on December 10th We're going to have a new location, so it'll be 4 to 5 potluck and a 5 to 7 meeting for families. We do it on Sunday to help LA families with traffic. And then email Andrea at evoketherapy.com for more information or to RSVP. Pursuits trips anywhere in the world, any activity, young adults or families to have like a therapy light experience. If you want to set something like that up, you can also combine that with therapy. All right, some questions have come in. First question, can you please summarize the counter moves category again? Do you do 1, 2, 3 from the slide, or do you do not? Oh, let me go back to that, just to help you out. For those of you who are watching on webinar, for those of you who are watching on, listening on podcast, it won't make much difference at all to you. Counter moves are what happen to you when you make a change. When you make a healthy change, you don't do any of these things. This is not what you do. Counter moves are what people do to you when you make a healthy change in your life. You're like your child, which is you're wrong, and then they give volumes of evidence to support it. Change back, and I'll accept you again, mom or dad, brother or sister, right? Parent or child. And if you don't change back, then these are going to be the consequences. Now, it's interesting the way you ask the questions. Can you please summarize the counter moves category again? Because I think the question was asked in such a way like, is this something you do as a parent? Not ideally, right? This is not a behavioral process, not a behavioral program. This is a program of healing. My book and the book on behaviorism says, before you go about trying to change a behavior, consider what the behavior can teach you before you change it. So listening therapy is more effective than simple behaviorism. Although behaviorism has its place, right? We need not abandon that also, but look at it more in a complex way. Next question: do you think that an almost 17-year-old could benefit from reading this book? She is looking to take control of her anxiety, and it has come a long way. I think so. Good question. I do think so. I'm going to recommend it to some people that I know that have struggled with anxiety for a long period of time, because I think it has value. It talks to people who I think have been trying kind of the common sense way out of it, or the intuitive way out of it, which is avoidance, right? So absolutely. We do not do counter moves. We do not do them. Counter moves are what people do to you. According to that's Harriet Lerner's idea. It's also well illustrated in the book, The Dance of Anger. Counter moves are what people do to you when you change in a healthy way. Now, I think the reason that people are confused on this broadcast is because it looks and sounds a lot like parenting, right? When your child does something quote unquote wrong, this is how you respond. But that's where the real insight is, folks. If with our children we simply get angry, frustrated, disappointed with them, and we pile on top of them shame, on top of whatever they're dealing with, it's causing the symptom, then they don't grow up in their lives really knowing themselves, right? They don't grow up in their lives knowing what's right and wrong. They don't grow up in their lives knowing what boundaries are. So for more information, look at the webinar, the podcast webinar on The Dance of Anger, Healthy Boundaries, The Dance of Anger by Harriet Lerner, or read her book. It's a fantastic read. Counter moves are something that people do when you make a healthy change, to punish you, to keep you back in line. So, all right, folks, I'm going to be doing an open forum tomorrow night, Q&A. Send in any questions in advance. Please invite siblings, family, or friends, anybody that you would like that might be curious about what goes on here, curious about what you're learning. If you want to share, send in some questions you would want them to hear me answer ahead of time and invite them. So we'll send out the invitation first thing in the morning so you can send that link to other people. All right, hope this is a helpful point of contact. Thank you. I'll see you tomorrow night, Wednesday, October 25th at 7 p.m. Mountain Time. Have a great evening. Take care. Bye-bye.